Hey guys, this is Alex for Quirks with another 3ds Max tutorial, and today we're gonna take a look at global illumination or indirect illumination in VRay. So as you can see, I've already set up a basic scene here in 3ds Max with a few different objects. One of them is refractive. We're gonna take a look at the materials in a moment. And I'm using a VRay physical camera just because it makes it a lot easier to adjust the exposure in the scene. And I also have this backplate here that's gonna help me with reflections. And it's also a form of indirect lighting if you have indirect illumination enabled. So I'm using two light sources. One of them is a basic skylight here. So it's just a VRay light in the ceiling, which I probably can't say. Okay, there it is. So it's visible. The invisible checkbox is not checked. It has a multiplier of 30, which is the standard setting. I can easily leave it at that because I usually just adjust the exposure in the camera. And then I have a second light right here. It's double-sided, so it also illuminates the back here, and it's invisible. So let's take a look at the materials. Let's hit M on our keyboard. Whoops. Okay. So for the floor, I have a basic view. Actually, I only have basic VRay materials for this one. And for the floor, I use a reflective map, just some procedural smoke. It's hardly noticeable anyways at the settings that I'm using, so you actually shouldn't care about that too much. And then I have a checker map, just to add a little more color to the scene. And here I'm using VRay dirt for the walls, so the areas where you have occlusion are a little bit more reddish to simulate dirt. And I have a displacement map, just to kind of simulate some unevenness on the surface. And then I just have two plastic-like materials with another reflective map, and this one here, a refractive material with dispersion turned on. So this way you get all this light breaking through it and creating color fallout. I'm gonna show you what it looks like in a second. And yeah, that's basically the scene. And here's the two renders, one of them with global illumination enabled. It's this one, and this one with only direct illumination. And I think you can already notice quite a big difference, because this one is a little bit darker, so the exposure is not as high, and you also get noise in some areas because there's just not enough light for VRay to accurately calculate the image, and that's usually when noise occurs. Whereas over here, the image is a little more exposed and the noise is gone. And I've been using about medium settings for this render, so I could have cranked them up a bit further to make it even smoother. Another thing you will notice is that over here there's a little more detail on the walls, whereas here we have a bit of blurring going on. I'm gonna explain why in a second, but for now just rest assured that's a common problem with global illumination. So now you're probably wondering, how do I turn global illumination on? And it's actually quite simple. You can either go up here to the render setup and click the button, or you can just hit the shortcut, which is by default F10. And then you go over to your comment tab. Make sure that VRay is enabled as your rendering engine, which it is in my case. Then you head over to Indirect Illumination and just hit the on checkbox. Now one thing that you will immediately see is that there are a lot of settings in here, and it also talks about primary and secondary balances and stuff like that. And by default, the secondary GI engine is set to brute force. I just had that enabled from the previous render. So as you can see, there are 4 different global illumination engines in VRay, and we're going to take a look at all of them with their advantages and downsides that they have. Also, in this tab you get the chance to turn on ambient occlusion, which will just bring out the details in your scene, which you probably need since most GI engines actually blur the image. So let's just start with the different engines. So the first engine is the primary engine, so to speak, is usually set to irradiance map, and the irradiance map is an interpolation based method. So what it doesn't actually calculate every single point in the illumination solution, but it just calculates a few of them and then it starts interpolating. Now if you come into the the irradiance map settings here, you can either select a preset. By default it's set to high, which for test renders you usually want to set to low or medium, depending on how fast your PC is. And of course you can also type in some custom values, and that's what I'm going to do right now. So this here is the exponent for the calculation density. And if you have the low preset enabled, it's going to be -3 and -1. Now, the higher these values are, so if I set 1 to 0 and 1 to 1, that's usually the high preset, I think. No, actually it's not, it's the very high. And what it's going to do is it's going to do additional calculations, and it's going to calculate even more samples. This can come in handy at some point. For example, if you want to avoid noise or flaky lighting. Then over here you have your H sphere. This is the hemisphere subdivisions, which are by default set to 50, which is usually just fine. And hemisphere subdivisions practically means, and I have something prepared for that, hang on. So when VRay casts indirect illumination, what it does is the light hits a certain spot in the image, and then it starts bouncing from there in a hemispheric shape. So this is your surface, this is the point, and then it just starts casting rays. So this is what it looks like, sort of as a sketch right here. And the higher these subdivisions are, the more precisely these will be calculated. And as I've already mentioned, the irradiance map is an interpolation based method, so you can also adjust the interpolation samples. Then you have several different options down here. For example, you can turn on show calculation phase, which you usually want to do because it helps you with your test renders. This way you do not have to render the entire image to see that something might be wrong. Then you can also show direct light in the irradiance map calculations, which might give you an additional preview. So personally I like to keep this on. Then here you have a few settings for the preview, which I personally just leave it full preview. And then what these two here mean, we will look at in a moment. So that's something that we're going to tackle later. Then we have detail enhancement, which might become necessary because global illumination solutions usually blur the image a bit. So this is just a way of counteracting that. And here's the different interpolation methods that it uses and the sample lookups. And personally, what I say is that the settings as they are right here are fine. Maybe you want to adjust them if you want to do very quick test renders, but I just leave them as they are by default. Then here are several modes which come in handy once you start using global illumination with an animation. And that's practically it. Then our second engine is brute force. Brute force global illumination works a lot different from irradiance map because it does not really interpolate. What it does is, as the name pretty much implies, it just casts rays over rays. So it is physically accurate, even more so than the irradiance map, because it doesn't interpolate. And it has the advantage that the detail in the scene will not be lost due to that fact, but it also takes ages to render. And so that's not what you usually want to use, especially since it creates a lot of noise, unless you crank these settings here up very high. So the higher the subdivisions, the more samples it will use per ray, and the higher the secondary bounces, the more often it will bounce before it actually disappears. And then down here we have the caustics, which we are not going to look at today. And then we have a few additional GI engines. And what I forgot to mention is the difference between a primary bounce and a secondary bounce. So in VRay, a primary bounce is a light bounce that is visible either directly through the camera or through refraction or reflection. And basically what it means is those are the things that will actually be directly visible on the camera, whereas the secondary bounces will only be seen because they are used for the global illumination lighting solution. So these are more subtle and usually not visible directly. And then we have two more GI engines that we haven't talked about yet. One of them is the photon map. So what the photon map does is it works very closely to how light is emitted in nature. So it actually uses a photon map, and every single one of these lights has a photon map. And what happens if you use the photon map is that the light will just emit photons that then start bouncing around the scene and creating the illumination. Now, personally, I don't like using it because it creates very flaky results unless you bump up the settings very high. So here's your settings. You can even convert it to an irradiance map if you want. Then you have your interpolation samples, the number of bounces that the photons can do, how many photons there are. Of course, the higher you crank this up, the longer it's going to take. And then some additional settings, such as the multiplier, which is basically not a good idea to adjust because it's going to create results that are not physically accurate. So you usually want to keep this at 1.0. And then you can even load a photon map from a file if you want to, in case you had calculated it beforehand. And so as I've already mentioned, it is fast, but it also creates some noise, and it uses a lot of RAM, which is why personally my favorite solution is to use the irradiance map as a primary bounce and the light cache as a secondary. Now, what is light cache? Light cache is a path tracing algorithm that's basically just creating a lot of paths emitted from the camera directly to then start bouncing to the scene, through the scene, until they hit a light. So this one has the advantage that it's very fast and quite accurate, and it doesn't really create noise. But there, of course, is also a downside to it, because it doesn't really work too well with bump maps, and furthermore it also blurs the image, just like the irradiance map. And there's a few things that you can adjust. So first of all, the subdivisions. This is basically the rays or the paths that are going to be casted from your camera. Of course, the higher they are, the more accurate the light cache map will be, but it will also take longer to calculate. Then you can turn on show calc phase, which is basically going to show you the indirect illumination paths. And you can select restore direct light, which can usually help with making the overall lighting solution a little bit smoother. And then you can turn on adaptive tracing, which basically means it only traces as much paths for a certain area as it actually needs to. And it also comes with several different modes, which we're also going to look at in a second. So these are actually the settings. Hang on. These are actually the settings that I've used for the render that we've seen before. And it worked out just fine. And it was actually pretty fast. Of course, it took longer than if I had just used direct illumination. But for what I need, it was fine. I also turned on ambient occlusion and left the multiplier here at 0.8, which is the default value. But I turned down the radius to 5 instead of 10 because I wanted a more subtle ambient occlusion. Then as far as post-processing goes, you can also adjust saturation, contrast and the contrast base of the indirect illumination pass. And what this will do is, of course, saturation, the higher it is, the more vivid your colors will look and the stronger they are. Whereas if you lower it, it's eventually going to go just black and white if you turn it to 0. Then the contrast, which is also pretty self-explanatory, and here you have the contrast base. If you set it higher, then the image will get brighter overall, and if you set it lower, it's going to get darker. And now let's talk about the different animation settings that we have here. So the irradiance map has one disadvantage that we haven't talked about yet. If you render animations, you will either need very high settings or you will have to interpolate between various maps, or otherwise you will get flickering in the video. So there are ways to avoid this flickering. Depending on what your scene looks like, they can be quite different. So if you just have a fly-through animation where the only thing in your scene is the moving camera and the rest is just static objects, so this is something that commonly occurs with architectural visualization, then you usually won't need the animation preset, and it's going to be fine like that. But what you can do is you can turn the fly-through mode in the light cache on. And then what you also want to do is you want to use the camera path. And what that means is that there's going to be an irradiance map for the entire camera path. Not so that's the path that the camera travels along through the entire scene. What it means is that your scene will be calculated entirely during the primary pass right here. Whereas if you had not turned this checkbox on, it would only calculate from the current viewpoint, which would create issues once you start moving the camera, because then you would have artifacting in the indirect illumination solution. And however, if you have moving objects in your scene, what you will need to do is you will have to turn on the animation settings. And you start with the pre-pause. Basically what it does, and I've prepared one right here, but that's not for this scene, that's for a different one. It will save out the irradiance map for every single frame in the animation to your disk, so you can specify a folder. And once that's done, you just go to animation rendering and you load your indirect illumination map. And suddenly you will notice that something has changed here. Suddenly this interpolation frames checkbox is turned on, which basically means that it will start interpolating between the different frames. So what it does is, if you have, let's say, 300 irradiance map passes saved to disk, for one for each frame, in this case it will interpolate the current frame irradiance cache map with the 2 before and the 2 after it. So it will interpolate between 5 maps. This is usually fine for most cases, but if you want quicker results, you can turn it down to 1, depending on how good or how bad the lighting in your scene is. So sometimes this can create artifacting, and then you will probably even have to turn up to 3, which is going to sample between 7 different maps, and it's going to take even longer. So I don't recommend it unless you really need it. Just leave this at 2, it's going to be fine. And then you can lower the interpolation samples to something like 10 or 15, just because the maps are already calculated, so you do not need to interpolate them further, because it will even blur the image a lot more. And what you can do after you saved out the maps and are ready to render with the interpolation, you can turn off the secondary bounces engine, because the information from the secondary engine is already stored in these maps right here. So that's good to know, because otherwise you would spend additional time and you wouldn't really see a difference. So if you follow these steps, then you will be able to achieve flicker-free global illumination in VRay using the irradiance map and the light cache, which are usually known to produce some flickering and artifacting. But the big advantage of these 2 maps is that they are very fast and that they produce reliable results, whereas with photon maps you can never be too sure whether they are gonna be noise free or whether they are gonna be a lot noisy. So that's why I usually prefer irradiance map and light cache. I mean, for still images, these are perfect, and for animation you're gonna need a few tricks and quirks to achieve what you want. So yeah, that's pretty much all I have to say about global illumination for now, and I hope you enjoyed the video.